That was very kind. I hope I get applause at the end, too. Title's up there, Creative Thinking, Processes, Strategies, and Knowledge. Processes, Strategies, Skills, and Errors. I can't read my own overheads. Now, this is going to cover a lot of ground, okay? My background is in industrial and organizational psychology. It's a little bit distant from education. The focus here will be predominantly experimental, but with very, very significant educational implications. Why is an industrial and organizational psychologist interested in creativity? When I started in this field, everyone thought I was a mutant, basically. That has changed. The highest priority in industry at this point in time is enhancing creativity and innovation in the workforce. That's not made up. That's the senior executive statements. We also want creativity because of human progress. We want it because of personal growth. We want it because of life enhancement. All of those count. And we've been concerned about this for many, many years. And the basic research here was really ability models. We also have personality models. We also have motivational models. We have affect models, which are relatively recent. We have team performance models. We have climate models. We have institutional models, meaning how do institutions support creative work. And we have cultural models, meaning what does culture do to creativity. These are a lot of models, okay? There are a lot of them. They're very different. And within an area, the people typically don't agree. Multiple models, but the other thing to realize here is they're working at multiple levels. Institutions are not individuals. And because we're looking at creativity from very different lenses with multiple different lenses, what we find is creativity doesn't seem to have anything. It can seem like air, okay? That has led to a key issue in creativity studies. What is creativity? Now, the early answer to this, and it is evident in Torrance's work, and it is evident in Guilford's work, is creativity is ultimately about the generation of ideas. And the measures built were to measure how rapidly, how effectively people could generate multiple alternative ideas to problems, okay? That's a problem, believe it or not, so to speak. Because what those measures really are they're measures of basic ability. Can you solve multiple different creative problems in very different fields? And if you're assessing kids, little kids, to see who's creative, that's what you want to know. You want to know, can they solve multiple different creative problems in multiple different fields? But that leaves a big question unanswered. And the big question unanswered is what fundamentally is creative problem solving? Now, there are two key answers here, two key articles that provide an answer. They're looking at creative products, and both articles are having people rate creative products. This is Bessemer, O'Quinn, and Christians. They get the same basic set of conclusions. That is, creative output on a problem is original, it's of high quality, and it's elegant. Original, high quality, and elegant. If there are any math people in the room, they'll appreciate elegance, the rest of you won't. Okay? That's not the total answer, though. Okay? It's really not the total answer. Because what we're doing is defining creativity to attributes of the performance we see. Is it an original performance? Is it a quality performance? That's where the definition has gone to over the last 5 years. It's production of high quality, original, and elegant solutions. Note the next part of this statement. 2, complex, novel, ill-defined problems. Meaning creativity is bounded to a certain type of problem. It doesn't apply to all. The other thing to realize is creativity is a problem from the perspective of the person. A creative problem to a 6-year-old is not a creative problem to a 12-year-old, which is not a creative problem to a 24-year-old. The other thing you have to bear in mind is the readiness of the problem to be solved. A quick example here. Multiple innovation, tons of creative work in the electrical industry between 1910 and 1935. But that's because the problems were there and the technology could now be deployed to solve them. So it's both the readiness of the person and the readiness of the problems that counts. Now, I like this definition a lot because it explains a lot about what we know about creative people. They're open, they're obsessive, they're persistent, they're achievement motivated, they're dominant, and I'll throw this in as well, they're hostile. They are strongly engaged in the tasks they're working on. They need support. This is a high-risk venture. A novel, complex, ill-defined problem is not something that you are guaranteed to solve. You need a feeling of psychological safety. Institutions have to provide resources. They're critical. It's a novel, complex, ill-defined problem. It's going to involve a lot of people and a lot of time. And you have to learn to fundamentals. All the time, you have to learn to the fundamentals. And by the way, this applies to industries. Successful industries focus on certain fundamentals. Now, having looked at this mess and said the definition I just gave you is great, and I clearly love that definition, we have multiple models, and I made a decision very early in my career. I wanted to focus on the fundamental. And the fundamental to me is how do people go about solving complex, novel, ill-defined problems? That's the key question. How do they solve them? Now, this is not a unique interest in any way, shape, or form. Fink, Ward, and Smith have a model, generation and exploration. Isaacson and Parnes have a convergent, divergent processing model. Sternberg has an analogical thinking model. In fact, Dewey, in 1910, produced the first model of creative thinking processes. In all, we looked at about 40 extant models of creative thinking processes. We reviewed them under two assumptions. If you're going to solve a problem, you need knowledge. You cannot solve problems blind. This is not a divergent thinking ability, which you can do blind. This is you have to solve the problem. Second, the problems have to be real world. They have to produce a viable solution. And this would be the model we came up with. First, what people do is they define the problem. Next, what they do is they gather information in the problem. After that, they combine those concepts and cases they have selected to account for that information. They use those new combinations to generate viable ideas. They don't trust the ideas they generated, so they evaluate them extensively. They plan implementation, and planning is not passive. It is setting up a framework for action and learning. And they adaptively monitor the work as they engage in it. You guys got this? I'm going to go through this in excessive detail here. I just want to put up the overhead. Here's what that says. Every one of those processes is demanding. My favorite study here is a study by Mike Sitz-Mahaly. It was done with artists. He was looking at problem definition. And he was looking at why artists stared at objects. And he found that those who produced viable art products, literally painting sculptures, would sometimes stare at an object for 24 hours, come back and stare at it again the next day, and then come back the next day and stare at it again. Meaning they were spending enormous time defining the image they wanted to create. But look at the time frame there. This is demanding. Second thing, in any Any competent artist will tell you this. Art depends on using knowledge, both of form, figure, color, texture. Same applies with scientists. Ideas don't appear by magic. They come out of conceptual combination. What that means is there is nothing new under the sun. Rather, there are new combinations of what is under the sun. These ideas, when someone combines knowledge to create a new piece of knowledge, a new concept, that's a new concept and new knowledge. It's fuzzy. It might not work, meaning there's extensive evaluation. And it's worse. Execution of every one of those processes requires both convergent and divergent thinking in executing the processes. That means people are going to fail. There are multiple steps in executing each of those processes. They're painful. They take time. Failure is kind of assured. The current going guess we have is Huber's work, which is 1 out of 100 real creative efforts succeeds. That's not a bad baseline. And it's worse, because the way that model was set up, look at those arrows. You make a mistake in information gathering, you're not going to have the right concepts and cases. That means the errors flow through. Now, note what I said earlier. Creativity is ultimately based on knowledge. Our first study here was a very direct study. It's not a population you guys will be familiar with. I love them. That's the military. We had, actually in this study, 2,000 Army officers. This is a subsample. We gave them military tasks. Military has a very nice task list for its officers. We told them to sort the tasks. We then coded their sorting on how close it came to theoretical models of military officer activity, which is in essence a measure of expertise. What we found is there was a correlation of 0.40 to, here are our creative performance tasks. In 1995, solving the problem of invading Iraq. Iraq is a virtually impossible place for the military to invade. We're a little ahead of schedule on that. 2, how to restructure the United States military in a regimental structure as opposed to a divisional structure. How well did you perform resolving critical incidents? Meaning, I don't have my tanks running, and my tanks have to run. What did you do? And how many medals did you win? Medals are awarded for service above and beyond the call of duty, meaning medals apply and reflect officer creativity. The average effect there was 0.40. That's the average correlation, meaning expertise is strongly related to creativity. Now, the next study here plays on that. In this study, this is the Hester study. We had 200 some undergrads, 2 samples. One sample was to devise an advertising campaign for a new high-energy root beer drink. Undergraduates like that a lot. They were also to design a curriculum in the second sample for a new experimental secondary school in the state of Oklahoma. Judges were going to evaluate the quality, originality, and elegance of the new root beer advertising campaign, the new experimental secondary school. Before they did that, we trained them as to how to illustrate their mental models for understanding schools. In structural equation modeling terms, we trained them to do it by having them work through a sports team mental model. They work through the sports team mental model. They then apply that to understand the educational problem. They then apply that to understand the marketing problem. We code those for a number of variables. This is important. What came out? The mental models counted again. Okay? About at a 3-5 level, and they were particularly important for those high in divergent thinking ability. Okay? Part 1. But part 2. Their mental models were accurate, they were in depth, but they were not necessarily novel. Okay? It's more important to understand the world first before you're creative. Next 2 studies here, both very important. We have 3 types of knowledge we talk about when we talk about creativity. One type of knowledge we talk about is conceptual knowledge. Another type of knowledge we talk about is case-based knowledge, meaning experiential knowledge. Third type we talk about is associational. We primed undergraduates to use conceptual knowledge, use case-based knowledge, to use associational knowledge in solving creative problems. What we found is 2 types of knowledge worked. Associational knowledge does not. People do not work through creative problems with associational knowledge. They work it through with experience or cases, and they work it through with concepts. That leads to an earlier study, which is of Scott Lonergan and Mumford. And again, we have them drawing up plans for this experimental secondary school. But I love educational people for this. There are some things you guys do great. And what you do great is you write cases and then pull out the key concepts in those cases, publish the case, and publish the key concepts. We equated them here. Okay? Equated, so it's exactly, the concepts are drawn exactly from the cases. 2 to 4 cases, 8 to 28 concepts. Here are the findings. Giving people more concepts improves creative problem solving. Giving people fewer cases improves creative problem solving. And in a recent study, this is important, giving them key diagnostic cases improves creative problem solving. Meaning you want to apply concepts to a limited number of key cases. And the reason people can't work with a lot of cases is they're very complex. There's a lot of information in there. There's information about resources, causes, restrictions, actors, actor affect. They can't work with that much information. So they need to have exactly the right cases and a rich body of concepts. In essence, that gives you the conclusions here. With one thing I want to add in, expertise. These concepts and cases, they're not acquired quickly. Very slowly, very painfully. People don't like to think abstractly, and they don't like to refine their experiential knowledge. And you're typically looking at about a 10-year cycle to get people to the level where they will have enough expertise to solve real-world creative problems. Now, the next part of this, we now know knowledge is critical. So the next issue was, okay, does this process model work? Can we get evidence for every one of those processes? First study here is the Mumford-Sapinski study. We had 137 undergrads. We had them design advertising campaigns for the 3D holographic TV, which is not quite here yet, but a few years ago, it wasn't here at all. This was creative. They were to design a TV advertising campaign, a magazine campaign, and a radio campaign. Again, we're going to evaluate it for quality, originality, and elegance. We also gave them public policy problems. Again, scored for quality, originality, and elegance. But we also devised specific tasks to measure problem definition uniquely, information gathering uniquely, concept case selection uniquely, conceptual combination uniquely. And the information gathering task, they saw cards. They saw a problem, and they saw different bits of information about that problem. And we timed how long they looked at each bit of information. Okay? On the conceptual combination, we gave them ostriches, sparrows, robins. We gave them handball, racket, football. Combine the two concepts, create a new concept. We're going to score that. Okay? Two key things, or three key things here. The effectiveness with which people executed each of those processes was multiple regression was in the mid-50s, 0.55. The reliability of the ratings was in the 70s. That's a big, strong relationship when you correct for unreliability. 2, all the processes made a unique contribution to predicting creative performance. 3, they predicted creative performance better than measures of intelligence, better than measures of divergent thinking. Now, since then, you can get away with so much in one study, okay? So what we've been doing is picking off the others as we go. One study we did, again with Army officers, was looking at generation of ideas. And we gave out the Guilford's consequences measure. What would happen if gravity was cut in half? But we scored it for recognition of critical events, recognition of negative outcomes. Now note, recognition of critical events, recognition of negative outcomes, that's critical for military officers. The findings were this: when scored for realism, competency for the military, and originality, we get a correlation of 0.45. Meaning idea generation counts as well, particularly idea generation within the demands of that occupational field. Strange and Mumford. Again, we're asking to develop plans for leading an experimental school, again scored for quality and originality. But we told them to reflect on their past school life, or not reflect on it. That was our manipulation. What we found is those who were creative reflected on their past life, which means monitoring and self-monitoring counts. Gibson and Mumford. This is my favorite study, by the way. What we have here is a clothing company expanding its market to the southern U.S. They are presented with ideas from teams working for them as a senior manager. So each team's going to give the senior manager an idea. The senior manager is to criticize the ideas, okay? Then we code what they wrote in their criticisms. And here's what we found. Those who produced a limited number of deep criticisms, produce solutions of higher quality, originality, and elegance. Deep criticism counts. Martelaritz and Mumford study. In this study, we were asking them to do a reorganization plan for a failing automotive firm. Specifically, the case was drawn from American Motors. The undergrads didn't know that, though. They're working in teams. They prepare a plan. We gave them a planning skills measure. Okay? All the team members complete the planning skills measure. At the end of the task, they nominate their leader. We pull out their planning skills. We find a very strong relationship between planning skills and creativity. People are creative, plan how they're going to act. Now, two other studies. One is important for you guys, one is important for theorists. When you have a process model, the question is, do errors flow through the processes? That is the critical evaluative question with the process model. In this study, we asked them to develop an advertising plan for a cookie company who had a ginger doodle, new ginger doodle. Okay? Judges praise Q&E, but at different points, an email from the putative supervisor as they do this asked them to define the problem, it asked them to gather information, etc. And other emails sometimes appeared and sometimes didn't appear. And that email presented distracting information to induce error. Here's what we found. Errors flow all the way through. If we distracted them in problem definition, their information gathering was not as good. If we distract them in information gathering, their conceptual combination was not as good, but concept and case selection was bad. Meaning the errors literally flow through. From a psychological perspective, that is critical validation evidence. Second study we did, I needed distractor questions on a study of ethics. And we were studying graduate student ethics. I hope your graduate students are ethical. Half of our problems, though, were creative thinking problems. And they were tied to specific processes. And here's what we found. Social scientists, conceptual combination, and idea generation were incredibly important. Biologists didn't care about that. Biologists cared about information gathering and conceptual concept organization. Health people didn't care about any of those things. They cared about problem definition and planning. Now, this is to say that all of these processes are always relevant, and they are. But some processes are particularly important in some occupational fields, not others, which means you have to target your education on those critical processes. I don't need to say anything else here, I do not think, but I do want to point out one thing. Note the problems here. These are military problems, education problems, marketing problems, consulting problems. This is not task specific. These processes generalize across a number of domains. Now, I'm not going to go into as much detail on this part of the discussion. We've also been looking at what strategies should people use in executing each of these processes. When you define a problem, do not define it to goals. Goals are bad for creative work. Define it to constraints and define it to procedures. That's what helps. In information gathering, do not do a diverse search for information. Search for key facts and, importantly, anomalies that cannot be accounted for by those key facts. And extend the search. The more time you spend searching for anomalies, the better. Concept selection. In a series, by the way, constant adaptation is incorrect. That is constraint adaptation. Sorry about that. Search for cases, search for constraints, search for application, search for error management concepts. Believe it or not, creative people search for concepts that will help them manage projected downstream errors. Don't make your concepts too narrow and don't make them excessively broad. Conceptual combination. Search for shared and non-shared features of those cases and concepts. What's in common, what's not. Map out those shared and unshared features and look for a concept that will integrate the shared and unshared features of the existing concept. And then elaborate that emergent feature ad nauseum. The more you elaborate features emerging from conceptual combination, the more creative the problem solution will be. Idea generation. In the real world, idea generation is most improved by appraising the task at hand and the constraints. What that means is you get your best idea generation when the ideas are tied to application. And extend the generation again. This is unambiguous. The best ideas come out after extended generation. They do not come out immediately. Almost everything that comes out immediately is a waste of time. Okay? Idea evaluation. Idea evaluation had a very bad reputation in creativity because we were not supposed to evaluate ideas or what we thought about. Actually, that's not what creative people do. Creative people are self-critical. Creative people evaluate ideas, but here's the trick. Creative people try to compensate for deficiencies in their ideas. The idea evaluation process is active, and you're trying to fix what's wrong. Implementation planning, and this one, two things here. One finding is absolutely consistent across 8 studies at this point. Creative people forecast more, and they forecast more extensively. They imagine everything that could happen with this idea that they've just evaluated and revised. How will it play out downstream? Who will like the idea? Who won't like the idea? Who will use the idea? Why would they use the idea? Forecasting is very, very strongly related to creative performance. But note what you have to do in forecasting. You have to envision a future you've never seen. Second thing in planning, unambiguous. Creative people, when they're forecasting, forecast obstacles. Every obstacle that might arise to prevent implementation of my idea, I will forecast. Adaptive monitoring. Creative people monitor actions, not goals. They monitor who did not the outcome. Second thing, they a priori establish key things to monitor, and they reflect a lot on why is this happening. In my world, the most common finding with managers of creative efforts is they spend about 20% of their time thinking about crises. And what they're asking themselves is, where did the crises come from? Why is it here? And what do I do about it? Now, creativity and the process model at this point we think is solid. We have multiple studies on every one of these processes. It works. But, and this is important, it's not just the strategies, it's not just the processes. Creative people need certain skills, general skills. One skill is causal analysis. We trained undergraduates in causal analysis skills. Think about causes that have big effects. Think about causes you can control. Findings were this. Training them in causal analysis had a sizable effect on the quality and originality of substantive creative problem-solving solutions. All three, quality, originality, and elegance. We trained forecasting. On these studies, what we did is we had them in a low-fidelity simulation, both experimental school and marketing simulations. They'd get in an email. The email would say, forecast what's going to happen. List your ideas, forecast what's going to happen with your ideas. They write out their forecasts, we code their forecast. 4 things came up. People forecast extensively over a longer time frame with about resources and about potential negative events, which goes back to a comment I made earlier. But here are the 2 big variables. How extensive the forecasting was and how long-term it was. Not about resources, not about negative events. This is why all senior managers are evil, okay? Self-criticism, error analysis. In these studies, what we did is literally have them work in a creative problem solution. Again, the educational leadership problem is praised for quality, originality, and elegance. But we trained them to think about system errors. We trained them to think about personal errors. We trained them to think about user errors. And what we found is training in those error management strategies, which means self-criticism, resulted in better creative problem solutions. Final thing, creative people don't like constraints. We've all said they all hate constraints all the time. No, that's not what the actual data says. What the actual data says is constraints enhance creative problem solving. Defining the constraints makes the creative problem solving better. And the constraints are best when imposed early, when they start. Final thing, we don't think creative people are wise. And the final key skill here is creative people are in fact wise. Their wisdom may be a little delimited to the problem they're working on, but they are very wise about how to develop and implement that problem solution. Now, for those of you, how am I doing for time? I'm almost done. I want to talk about two things very quickly. These are new studies, okay? We've ignored biases and errors, okay? And creativity, we have said every creative idea is good. No, that's clear from the rest of this talk. Not all creative ideas are good. And we wanted to look at biases and errors. In the bias study, what we did is have them form plans for an experimental secondary school. We looked at the literature on biases and errors, and then we coded how many of these biases we saw. Two types: simple biases, base rate fallacy; complex biases, illusory correlations. Findings here were this: simple cognitive biases don't impact creative problem solving. Complex cognitive biases do impact creative problem solving. And while it's a negative number there, we can teach people not to engage in complex biases. We can't teach them not to engage in simple biases. That's not bad news. Final study, errors. We looked at, literally we're giving them a marketing problem here. We're using the marketing error literature. Marketing literature has a very defined set of errors you don't make when producing a marketing plan. We built those errors into the problem literally. Half the problems had marketing errors in them, half did not. The task was we asked them to list potential errors in each problem, deliberate in those errors, and then fix the errors. Here's what we found. Those who deliberated on their errors were the most creative people. Creative people are obsessive about mistakes, and are especially obsessive about their own personal mistakes. Final study here I want to talk about, but it's going to lead to a broader comment. We can train creativity. It's unambiguous. This meta-analysis shows it. The average effect size for creativity programs produces a Cohen's delta of 0.70. A very well done creativity training program produces a Cohen's D of 1.1 to 1.2. That's a whopping big effect size. But the effect sizes produced by the most effective programs focus on processes, they focus on the strategies I just went through, and hopefully someday they'll focus on errors. This takes me to this model. This is my general model, Mumford's general model of creative problem solving. You need conceptual knowledge. You need case-based knowledge. You need a mental model for integrating that knowledge. That mental model and that knowledge is how you process information. And you process information using correct strategies. You need external skills, and you need to manage errors in executing those strategies. That leads you to a creative problem solution, and that in turn leads you to innovation. Now, this leads to a very, very important conclusion. That model does. Admit that it's an extension of the work I did, but it leads to a critical conclusion. And that is, in the creativity literature, we have differentiated ourselves from critical thinking. There are the critical thinking people over here, and we're the creative thinking people, and we're not going to talk to each other. That's not what the data says. It's not what this model says. What it says is what we need in the future is integration of critical and creative thinking if we're going to have viable educational programs. With that, I'm done.